Hello, wonderful AP Bio students, and welcome to our video on cell organelles version 2. We've been talking a lot about how cells produce things, how they produce proteins, how they package proteins, how they ship proteins. But how do they get all of those molecules to make all that stuff? Well, it's simple. Pac-Man. Actually, cells eat. They like to grub down just like we do. I'm not saying they're big fans of chilies, but cells do eat. Now, cells don't have a mouth or teeth or stomachs or digestive tracts, but they have specific organelles and structures that help them ingest and digest food to give them the raw materials to make those proteins and those carbohydrates and those lipids. So let's take a look at what they are. This is a picture of a cell, obviously, and the key organelle I want to talk about is an organelle called a lysosome. Now, lysosomes are basically sacs of digestive enzymes. And I want you to think of the lysosome as the stomach of the cell. Okay, so if the cell were to have a stomach, the closest thing would be a lysosome. And what a lysosome does is it has these digestive enzymes and it breaks down large molecules very quickly and very efficiently. Lysosomes are made in the rough endoplasmic reticulum. They're a protein. The enzymes that are in them are proteins. So those enzymes are made in the rough endoplasmic reticulum. They're sent to the Golgi apparatus from the endoplasmic reticulum, where then they are sent off in remember what these little guys are called, these little escape pods? These are our transport vesicles, and their whole goal is to seek and destroy. So their whole purpose, lysosomes, is to find big things that need to be digested and gobble them up and break them down. Now, they do that by working with another process that this cell does, which is moving things in and out of the cell by kind of moving its membrane around. So you can see that these right here are large food particles. Okay, maybe they're, hamburgers or fried rice, large food particles that need to get into the cell. So what happens is they move into the cell membrane, and the cell membrane actually engulfs it and closes around it. And then the cell membrane will pinch off a little pod, and now we have this little what's called a food vacuole, which is basically the food surrounded by what used to be cell membrane. So then the food vacuole will move through the cell, and the lysosome's like, oh, I must seek and destroy any big molecule. So the lysosome's like, oh my gosh, there's a big molecule. The lysosome fuses, basically its membrane becomes part of the this food vacuole membrane. It fuses to it and it releases these digestive enzymes to break down this big piece of food. So now we have these little chunks of food left, which are probably just going to be waste. The small chunks and things that we're going to need are going to be moved throughout the cell to the spots that they need to go. Well, then this needs to leave the cell. So the cell membrane will then kind of like spit out those waste products. And we have some words that we use to describe this. When the cell is folding in on this side, we call it endocytosis. And specifically, when it's folding in a large molecule, we call it phagocytosis. Okay? So phagocytosis has to do with folding in or actually folding out a large molecule. When molecules need to leave the cell via the cell membrane, we call it exocytosis, and that is the membrane folding out. So N means, I just think of in, and X, I think of exit. So endocytosis is molecules folding in. exocytosis is molecules folding out. When we're folding out small molecules, we call it penocytosis. Penocytosis. So when we're folding in or out small molecules, it's penocytosis. Large molecules is phagocytosis. So there we go. That's how we move molecules in and out and how they get digested. Let's look at how this happens in living things and with some examples. I'm sure you guys have heard of an amoeba. An amoeba is something that you've probably swam through. It's found in water bodies pretty much everywhere. And it's a unicellular organism, which means it's an organism, unicellular, that consists of only one cell. So it doesn't have a mouth, it doesn't have a stomach, it doesn't have a digestive tract. So in order to eat, it performs endocytosis. And in this case, it's eating something big, so it is performing phagocytosis. So what happens is it'll come up and it'll be like, bump into food. It'll be like, wow, food. And it'll actually fold its whole body around the food particle, and it'll create this little pocket of food within the body where then the lysosomes will come to meet it to digest it. I always think it'd be kind of funny if we ate this way. Like if I wanted like a banana, and in order for me to digest it, I just kind of like put it on my arm, and then my skin grew around it, and like then all the lysosomes came and took apart the banana and used all the good stuff. Luckily, we don't have to eat that way, because in that phrase, like you are what you eat, would really be true. We'd have like banana shapes and avocado shapes and I don't know, Starbucks coffee shapes, all over until our body digested it. So this is just kind of one way that phagocytosis is seen when in the standpoint of a whole organism. Let's talk about lysosomes and when there's something wrong with them. I would like to talk about a disease that is a genetic disorder called Taysachs disease. And it's a disorder where on the 15th chromosome, so you have 23 chromosomes total, on your 15th chromosome, there's a little tiny mutation that codes for an incorrect protein. And that protein happens to be an enzyme, and that enzyme happens to be hexosaminidase. Okay, this little complicated, crazy word right here. So you have like a malfunction in the instructions to make this hexosaminidase, so it's made incorrectly, and so it doesn't work. And we know it's an enzyme because it ends in ASE, by the way. Well, when hexosaminidase does work, it breaks up what we call gangliosides. It's already underlined in red for me, how nice. And gangliosides are a specific type of lipid. And what we see in people with Taysachs disease is that these lipids tend to accumulate in nervous tissue, specifically the brain, and they actually cause degeneration of the nervous tissue. So when somebody is born with Taysachs disease, you don't really see symptoms for the first few years until that accumulation starts to occur, and then they show signs of nervous system stress, like they're unable to hear or talk or swallow, and eventually they're unable to move their limbs, and eventually they don't really live. So Taysachs is a very serious disease, and it's genetic. It's passed down, and actually it's interesting. There's a high proportion of Taysachs carriers. It's a recessive trait in I think I'm pronouncing this right, the Ashkenazi Jews, through the founder's effect. So that's when you have a small population is the basis for repopulating a whole new area. Well, somebody in that population or two people in that population made it so that this disease is at a higher instance. So actually 1 in 27 of Ashkenazi Jews are carriers of Tay-Sachs disease. So we see a higher instance of this disease within that population. Kind of interesting. Lysosomes are also used in a process that is called metamorphosis. Metamorphosis. And I hope when you were little you got to go to a pond and collect some tadpoles and put them in a bucket and watch them grow into frogs. And I'm sure as you watch them grow into frogs, we know that frogs don't have tails, right? So we have this weird little fishy tadpole-y thing. And eventually they grow legs and arms and their tails disappear. Well, what happens is during a specific point in their life cycle, lysosomes in the tail cells are triggered to basically digest those cells. So it's the lysosomes within the cells are essentially destroying those cells. So that is how tadpoles lose their tails. Kind of interesting. Another organelle I want to talk about that is related to a lysosome is what's called a peroxisome. And peroxisomes are characterized as just like a membrane sac. They typically have, when you have a TEM picture of them, they typically have kind of a crystalline structure on the inside, and the crystalline structure is enzymes, just a ton of enzymes. And these enzymes specialize in detox. So you can guess what organ these are in. They are found in the liver. So again, if you're a drinker, drug user, you love peroxisomes because they are the ones that help detox your body from that awful stuff. So let's talk a little bit more about the process of peroxisomes. Peroxisomes are super good at taking toxins and breaking them down into one thing. They take a toxin and they break it down into something that sounds a lot like their name, hydrogen peroxide, which is H2O2. Okay? The thing about hydrogen peroxide is that isn't that good for us either. So peroxisomes are really efficient at taking the toxin and breaking it into another toxin. But the thing about hydrogen peroxide is that this is easy to break into something that isn't very harmful to us at all. So then catalase, which ends in ASE, so we know it's an enzyme, is another enzyme that's really heavy in our livers. There's a lot of it in our livers. Takes hydrogen peroxide and breaks it into water and oxygen. So it's a two-step enzymatic reaction, but it takes those harmful toxins when we ingest alcohol and drugs, converts it to hydrogen peroxide, then catalase, then converts it to things that aren't harmful to us at all, which is water and oxygen. So those are peroxisomes. The last organelle I want to talk about is this, like the coolest organelle ever, right? This is, if I had to pick a favorite organelle, it would be the mitochondria. Mitochondria. So the mitochondria is really cool. First, it's a double membrane organelle, which basically just means it's got two membranes. And they're very, very cleverly named. The first membrane is called the outer membrane. Wow, so clever, right? And the inner membrane that's kind of all folded up and scrunched up within the outer membrane is called, you guessed it, the inner membrane. And these little folds right here, they're actually called cristae. You don't need to know that, but that's just what they're called. And the space in between is kind of important. It's actually very important. This space right here is called the matrix of the mitochondria. It's where Keanu Reeves hangs out. So the thing about the matrix is that it has this DNA floating around in it, but the DNA doesn't match the DNA in the nucleus of the cell. That DNA is called mitochondrial DNA. And it's not a lot of genetic information. It's far less than what we have, but it's totally different than what we have. And it stems from the idea that mitochondria came to exist in our cells through the endosymbiotic theory. So it was actually a prokaryotic cell that decided to hang out inside of a eukaryotic cell. And the thing about mitochondrial DNA is it's passed down maternally. So it's maternally passed, which means all the mitochondrial DNA, all the DNA that's inside of every single mitochondria and every single cell of your body is all from your mom. And the reason why is that, okay, so fertilization is a little rough on sperm. Sperm has to travel super far. A lot of times their tail falls off, which is powered by a bunch of mitochondria, which then goes to the tail. And then once it's fertilized, the egg will actually destroy the mitochondria that are within the sperm. So what is left is a bunch of mitochondria that's in the egg. And those are the mitochondria that end up in your cells as you grow and become you. So we can actually trace this mitochondria because it doesn't change because it's not expressed traits, right? We can trace this mitochondria pretty accurately through maternal lineage. And you guys remember mitochondrial Eve? Mitochondrial Eve was basically the first species that is most similar to us, or the first woman that is most similar to modern day humans. And we found that out through tracing back mitochondria. And so we call that woman mitochondrial Eve because her mitochondria is what stemmed our genes for our mitochondria. So very, very interesting. So besides that, mitochondria are very, very important because they produce something called ATP. And ATP is like currency. Well, it's more like energy. ATP is energy. This is my lightning bolt. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and it is energy for the cell. And our mitochondria are super awesome at producing this, and they produce it really fast with the help of enzymes. And there's two cycles that happen here. We have the Krebs cycle, and we also have a process called oxidative phosphorylation. And these are part of cellular respiration, which we are going to know so ridiculously well by the end of this unit. So these two very important cycles happen in the mitochondria, and these two cycles are really awesome at making ATP, which gives a cell which gives the cell energy to do things like move materials in and out, and make materials, and break apart materials, etc. This is what the mitochondria is, what makes the cell work. It's the powerhouse of the whole cell. So in review, we talked about lysosomes, and we talked about how they work with the processes of endocytosis and exocytosis. We also talked about how penocytosis is when small molecules are engulfed or released by the cell, and phagocytosis is when large molecules are engulfed or released by the cell. We also talked about Taysachs and how when lysosomes have an enzyme that isn't working properly, it can lead to diseases, and also how lysosomes can be involved in the destruction of cells, so like in metamorphosis of the frogs. We looked at peroxisomes and how if you're an alcoholic, you probably love your peroxisomes because they break down toxins in your liver through their enzymes, and they make hydrogen peroxide, which is then further digested by catalase into water and oxygen. Then we talked about mitochondria and how pretty much the awesome powerhouse of the cell and is in charge of making all of the energy, and also how mitochondria peculiarly has its own DNA, which is passed down maternally. Hope you enjoyed our video on cell organelles part 2. Have a great night.